Hello and welcome to the 28th video that I'll be posting in my Unity platformer tutorial series. And in today's video, we will be reviewing all of our code. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to our scripts folder and we're going to talk all about these code right here. And the first code that I want to talk about is our player controller because it is our main programming source. Okay, once we've opened up Visual Studios, we can scroll up. And I'm going to firstly teach you all about these keywords here. And the first keyword that we've added inside of our player controller is using Unity Engine.ui, and that is for making sure that we are dealing with UI elements. So if you want to deal with UI elements, don't forget to type in using Unity Engine.ui. Using TM Pro here actually means we are using Text Mesh Pro, and if you want to program something with Text Mesh Pro, we have to type in this keyword, program text mesh. Give me a second. Program text mesh pro. So this code right here is for Text Mesh Pro, and Unity Engine.scene management is used for scene managing. So if you want to take in for scenes. So if you want to take in one scene and you want to change from one scene to another, you need Unity Engine.scene management. Okay, and in the public class, you do not usually change this, except if you are making a child script where you have to take or change the mono behavior to the name of the parent script. Okay, back to our player controller. In here, we've created our inspector variables, and rigid body here is used for, let me change my scenes to game level 1. Click on our player. And the rigid body here is used for adding forces, velocity, and gravity. And basically the physics in the game. And then composite collider is to mesh two different colliders into one. Layer mask. Layer mask is a inspector variable in which we can assign one of these layer here to be programmable by us in the Visual Studio. As you can see, specifies layers to use in physics. And then we have animator, which will act as our animation here, so we can change from one state to another. And then we have audio sources, which will act as our sound effects here, and we have to specify them by making sure we make them public so that we can drag each and specify which audio source we are using. Like right now, where we have two different audio sources, we need to make them public. And then we have our enum state here. Okay, and enum is basically making a list of variables or items that are stored in numbers, and you can change them and create a variable for that enum state, and that variable can only keep in or take the variables or items inside that list. So here we have our public enum state, and it contains idle, running, jumping, falling, hurt, and we make a variable called player state, and that means that player state can only take state.idle, state.running, state.jumping, state.falling, and state.hurt. And below this is our normal variables. So we have movement speed, and these variables here are just used to changing some of the names from our normal numbers to a variable that we can change in our inspector. And here in our void start here, we created or initialized our inspector variables. Those who are private need to be initialized. So rigid body is private, so we just say player RB, and then we want to get component. which component do we want to get? We want to get the rigid body component, and this applies for player collider, where we want to take composite collider, and player animator, where we want to take the animator. Yeah. And now this is where our programming starts in our void update. And first of all, as you can see here, we are adding a condition here so that if our player is hurt, then we cannot move because it will restrict our movement. And in our cherry here, we are adding if cherry num is larger than 10, larger or 10, then player current health is less than 3, which means that we have lost a heart. Then we need to minus the cherry num. That means we minus cherry num, and for this cherry num, we minus 10. Then we add our health by 1. And then we update the text by saying cherry text to text, and then cherry num. Cherry num is our number here, or the amount of cherries, and cherry text is our text mesh pro GUI. And then we are done with that. And then if the player current health is more than 4, then we cannot just do that, and then it becomes 3. Okay, and in our animation state here, we put it in our void update because, like I said before, this variable has to keep on running our update per frame. And this here is our player animation state so that this can communicate with our animator. And the way we can do it is by saying that we set the integer state to the number of our player state, and our player state is our enum variable, and our enum variable can contain numbers, as you can see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And yeah, and then we make sure we put in the int keyword here so that it takes in the number. And then player movement, this is where we move, and here we create a variable, and this variable is used to get the input specifically in our input manager, where we want to make sure that we get access to the horizontal one. So now the value will be -1 or 1, and then we can just use that to identify if we are moving left or right. And in here, if we are moving left, then we want to multiply the vector to left, and then we multiply by the movement speed, and then we multiply by time.delta time to make sure that we are moving at a specific time instead of how many frames are updating per second. And then we are transforming here, transform.local scale, to change the scale from our player so that we can see left or right. And this is also the opposite of this. Instead of vector to left, we are going right, and rotation left, rotation right. And this is just basically changing the scales. And then here we are pressing if our button is down, then our player is touching the ground, and then we activate our jump method, and our jump method, we specify that into our method here, where if jump method is called, then we have to change our player state to jumping. Then our velocity is also increased, and I always use mathf.absolute to help calculate. And then we have our animation state, where if our player is jumping, then we have to check if our velocity is going down. Then we have to change it to falling. And if it's falling, then if it's touching the ground, it goes to idle. Or if it's hurt, then we have to make sure that the velocity is already slowing down until it's at some point going to idle again. And then here, you're saying that if the velocity of x is moving left or right, then we have to change it to running because we are increasing, or our number is not that low that we can count it as idle. And if all of these fail, then we're just going to go to idle. And then we have our Ontrigger method here, where we say that if we collide with another object with the tag cherries, then we have to play the sound. We destroy that game object, and that is cherries, and then we add our cherry num. And then we want to update that to our cherry text, and that is essentially it. And here is where we collide with our enemy because we are not using an on-trigger enter, we are using on-collision enter, and our cherries here is using an on-trigger enter in their collider. And for our frog, we don't use that. So that is why we are using collision enter. And then we are just typing in the line of code, and that is if dot game object. We have to make sure or specify that if it's an enemy, then we are updating our cherry text, because usually when we crash, we want to update our health if we have more than 10. And then we do script communication, and this is only for our parent script. As you can see, we are taking in the game object. And then if the player is falling, then we want to kill it. And we can do this by saying enemy sprite, because that's our script communication variable. And then we want to say enemy death effect, which is found in the enemy script. So I have to open that first. Enemy script. And there you go, enemy death effect. And if not, then we have to make sure that if it's running or idling, then we get hurt. Then we transform our positioning to either we want to push left or push right. And we can check that by making sure that if other object is position X is higher than our position, then it's in the left position. Or yeah, we can just make sure that if X is bigger or smaller. And then we say that if this is 0, then at all costs we have to restart our game. And then here we are using void player footstep grass, and this is essentially given to our player, and it is connected to our animator player run here. And the way we can do that is by making sure we add event, and we add in specific points where we want to make sure that we are playing the player footstep grass. And that's it. And another feature actually that I want to teach you is actually making our frog into a prefab. So if we create a folder, and I'm going to name this frog prefab, and drag in our frog because I actually forgot to do this. And now if we get in our frog here, we can create a game object, create empty, and I'm going to name this frog, and then group. And then I can drag this frog inside the frog group. Then I can simply just drag in that, click on W so I can find where it is. And as you can see, if I spawn one frog here, it works. And all you need to do is actually change the values here of X pos max left and X pos min right. And let's say I want it to move here. Where is this? Negative 26. So this is negative 26. And let's say here, negative 29. Negative 29, 26. So negative 29. And then if we click on play here, as you can see, the frog is sliding, and you can make sure that this does not happen by checking the frog for a second and taking in the values by going to our player here and making sure we get our correct position, which is 26 and 26 and player 31. And then we can just go here and then say 26 and 31. So 26 and 31. Sometimes this is error because, as you can see, the X position is broken because this is a prefab. And the way you can fix that is by going to our player and clicking on our play button and see which are the correct points. And now you can see that the frog is moving here. And the edge here a little bit, I can just change in the position, but then as you can see, Both of these frogs are unaffected with their new change in position because we are just changing the public variable. Okay, and I can just basically change like 30 for example, and that should do the trick. As you can see, yes, it has worked, and yeah, you can just basically duplicate by using the frog prefab and just making sure you change the xpos max left and xpos min right based on the positioning. And then we are going to our frog script here. We are going to our enemy script where this is the parent script. And in the parent script, you don't need to change anything in the mono behavior on the top. And we are using the new keyword protected because this is how you tell that this is a parent script and this variable can be used for the child script. And then don't forget to add the protected virtual void start for our parent script. And then these are the initialization of our inspector variable. In here, we create a method called enemy death effect, and enemy death effect is basically where the enemy explodes, and enemy dead is when we destroy that game object. And in here, we actually use that enemy dead when in our frog here, in our enemy death effect here, if we click on this animation, we can see that we have added this animation event of enemy dead here. So it calls out that enemy dead method. And we are done with our enemy script. And now we can go to our frog here where we connect our frog with our enemy script so that our frog CS is our child script. This is our inspector variable. And if we create a public, then we can just simply drag in the colliders. And then we have our public float, and these are just our normal variables. And the way we can do this is we created a start function, and it uses protected override. And override is for overriding this start function because we want to add something. And if we type in base.start, we are simply calling this start function. And then we are going to type in frog collider equals to get component collider to D. And that is for our frog collider. And then in our void update here, we are transitioning. If jumping is true, then we want to make sure that if velocity is going down, then we are basically falling and jumping is false. And if it's touching the ground, then it has to go to idle. And I've created a specific method for idle, and this is called in our animator again, where once it goes to the idle position, I want it to play the idle animation first. Then we call in the frog movement by using the add animation. And this means that once it goes to the ground, it idles, it does the frog idle first, then it goes our frog movement, and it checks if it's facing left or facing right. And if it's facing left, then if the local scale is -1, and if it's hovering or touching the ground, then I want to make sure that it's facing left, okay? And then we want it to move. And if it's touching the ground, then it moves. And then if not, if these conditions aren't true anymore, it's going to face left to false. So basically it's facing right. And if facing left is false, which is fulfilled by using the else statement, then we want to say the opposing statement, which is if local scale is not -1, which is 1, then we want to make sure that it's -1. And then if transform position.x is larger than xpos min right, then we want to make sure that it's moving to the right, or it's jumping. Then we want to make sure it's jump when it touches the ground. And then we have to make sure that facing left is true once more. And then that is essentially it for our frog script. And I guess we can go to our health bar system. And in our health bar system, we've created our using Unity engine.ui. And this is for UI elements because we are dealing with UI elements. And here we created an array. An array is in a list, but we can find that list in our inspector components. And there are a lot of types of arrays like sprites, buttons, and many more. And it's usually indicated by these brackets here. So I use this to make sure that we can collect all of our hearts bar animation. And then we want to take in the image, which is our Hearts UI, so that we can change that. And in our void start, we created script communication with our player controller script. And the way we can do that is by creating a variable named player controller script. And then we just say player controller script equals to the game object. What game object specifically? Our player. And then we get component and the script. And then in our void update, we make sure that we update our Heart UI based on the player current health. And in our finishing point, we just say that we use the Unity scene management because we want to change scenes. And this is used to make sure that we are sure which level we want to load next and next scene load. And here in our void update, we just say next scene load equals to scene manager dot get active scene dot build index plus 1, and it's basically saying that we want to load the scene before we change scenes, and then if it's colliding with that object and then specifically the player, then we are going to change scene to next level load. And I can just say if next scene load, which is our public string, and I can assign that to different to our finishing point so that each level can have a different finishing point. And then I can just type in the name. And that is essentially it. Player fall is our trigger here. And it's basically there so that if the player is touching that collider, which is at bottom of the map, we want to restart the game. And in our main menu here, we don't change much except creating these methods that can be selected by our buttons. And that can be shown if I go to my scenes here, go to my level selection. And as you can see, if we go to our button here, in our button component, you can drag in the game object that has a script, and you can select the script or method that the script is assigned to. And yeah, that's basically it for our button. And in our game level 1 here, in our pause menu, we created a game object, which is in our canvas here, and it is a pause menu. And in our void update, if the player is pressing the escape button, then we want to make sure that game is paused to true. And this here, this keyword static here, is actually referring to a variable that is always online or stick to that script forever. And the reason why I want to make game is paused boolean is because we want to store if the player is pressing once, then we want it to pause the game, and if it's pressed again, then we want to resume the game. And that can be done by making sure that if game is paused equals to true, which means that the player has already clicked it once, then we want to resume the game. But then if it's still false, then we want to pause the game. And we can make sure by if public void resume game, then we want to make sure that the game is paused to false, and we want to make sure that pause menu is false, which means that it is disabled. But then if I say pause menu dot set active to true, then it is enabled, and we can see that the pause menu is active and game is paused to true. This is how essentially how we are calling in the variables. And we can also make sure that we are using time scale equals to 1, which means that the game is moving. And if I just say time scale equals 0, then the game is not moving at all. And load menu here is just for the button so that we can go to our level selection once more. And that is all our scripts, right? That is essentially it for all of our coding. And yeah, we're actually done with reviewing everything that you guys learned. And don't forget about the renderer here, where the renderer, there is our sorting layer here, and each and every sorting layer or renderer has the same sorting layer here so that we can see or make sure that we are rendering which one at the back or which one at the front. And you got to make sure that by going to our renderer, to all of your renderers like sprite renderer, tile map renderer, image renderer, and then you can just select those sorting layers. Okay, and I think that's it for today's video actually. I know in the previous video that I'm going to discuss about build settings, and I think I'm actually going to discuss that in tomorrow's video, because I think I've already covered up a lot of things, and thinking that I actually discuss all of our scripts, that's a lot to take in, right? So I'm just gonna end today's video here, and we're gonna discuss about build settings in tomorrow's video. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I hope you guys understand more about Unity platform making, and I'll see you in the next video.